Hi, nurses. Welcome to Shift Change, the podcast for nurses who are ready to shift their thinking away from the just a nurse mentality and into claiming their position as powerful agents for change. I'm your host, Amy Deagle, Chief Nursing Officer and President of the International Network of Nurse Leaders. Our mission at the International Network of Nurse Leaders is to amplify the voice of nurses, inspire the new generation of nurse leaders, and lead a change revolution in the nursing profession. Everything we do is because we believe in the power of nurses to change the world. So let's get started. Hi nurses, welcome back to another episode of the Shift Change podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If I could ask a huge favor, if you would take a moment to rate, subscribe, or review our podcast, that would mean the world to us. We love putting out this content for you, and those ratings and reviews really help us to continue to be able to do that. So if you would take a moment and do that, we would really appreciate it. I am really excited to be bringing you this week's guest, Mike Villeneuve. So Mike and I actually recorded this episode back in January before all the COVID craziness hit. And I was actually fortunate enough to meet him a couple weeks after we recorded this episode at a policy workshop that he was doing in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. And so I've had the great fortune of meeting him in person. He is an amazing example of a nurse leader, and I'm really excited to bring you this interview. So with 4 decades of progressive experience, Mike has participated in healthcare delivery as a nursing attendant, staff RN, nurse in charge in a remote First Nation, a clinical instructor, clinical nurse specialist, manager, researcher, lecturer, consultant, author, and administrator. As CEO of the Canadian Nurses Association, he leads CNA's operations, which include 139,000 members across all 13 Canadian provinces and territories, and is headquartered in Ottawa. In his role, he is leading implementation of a forward-leaning vision for professional nursing in Canada and the services needed in the future at CNA to support that transition. Mike is a member of the editorial board for the Sage Journal, Policy, Politics, and Nursing Practice, and serves on numerous other boards, national committees, and task forces. He is an adjunct lecturer at the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing at the University of Toronto. Since 2000, Mike has held teaching, executive, and consulting roles with Canada's Federal Office of Nursing Policy, OECD in Paris, Academy of Canadian Executive Nurses, CNA and its National Expert Commission, and the Lawrence S. Bloomberg Faculty of Nursing at the University of Toronto. From 2012 to 2017, Mike led his own consultancy in health policy, analysis, research, strategy, communication, serving governments, professional associations, unions, and universities across Canada and internationally. Earlier in his career, he was a clinician, educator, and then manager in the Neuro ICU and Neurotrauma units at Sunnybrook Health Sciences Centre in Toronto. One of 3 authors of CNA's Centennial History book, Mike is also the author of Public Policy in Canadian Nursing, Lessons from the Field, the first Canadian text focused on nursing and public policy, in 2017. Mike lives in rural Eastern Ontario, where he is proud to serve as a chair of the board of directors at the Winchester District Memorial Hospital, one of Ontario's highest performing small community hospitals. It is my great honor to introduce you to Mike Villeneuve. So welcome, Mike, to the Shift Change podcast. I am so excited to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much, Amy.
So, Mike, I know we just told the listeners a bit about you, but I always love to hear the longer version of your career story than what a bio provides. So, do you think you could walk our listeners through your nursing career, your journey so far, and some of the highlights you've experienced?
Sure, I'm happy to do that, Amy. And when I have the chance, I always start by sharing the fact that I grew up wanting to be a surgeon. And I had a grandmother who was a sort of director of nursing type in a very small rural hospital who, when we were grandchildren, my brother and I she used to drag us around the hospital, one of us on either side of her, hand in hand, as any proud grandmother would, and introduce us to people. And I remember her using her foot to kick open an operating room door. It's a very different time, right? This is the early 60s. And she was a formidable woman. And the doctors would stop and turn. And when she said, "These are my grandchildren," they were expected to greet us in the middle of surgery. And I remember being fascinated by what was going on behind those doors that you couldn't see through. And of course, it smelled like ether and all those things. And I just was completely captivated by it all. And targeted then, or directed my career to what I assumed would be a career as a doctor or a surgeon. And then I had the opportunity. I was about, I guess, 19. I was fresh out of, I guess, around my first year of university. And a friend's mother got me a job as an orderly, as a summer job. And the very first place I stepped into was an emergency room, which also was a place that had fascinated me as a TV watcher of medical shows as a little kid and stuff. And within 1 hour of arriving, I realized, I don't have any interest in what the doctors are doing. I want to do what they're doing, the nurses. Yeah. Never had occurred to me in my life. Never thought about it until that minute, and then never, ever changed from that minute till this day. With a fascination for what nurses were able to do, the way they talked. And emerge nurses are a bit of a tough crowd. Strong is what I mean. I don't mean tough as in mean, but that's a tough place to work. And there was something about their comportment and the way they acted that I thought, I want to be like that. So that was my first awakening to what a career as an RN could be. RN for me, I know there's many other categories, but that's what I wanted to do. So I pursued that. And as I said, have never looked back. So the first part of my career, like many nurses, was clinically focused. And I spent a lot of my time between graduation, in fact, even during a lot of my education, starting in 1980, in and around Sunnybrook in Toronto, very focused around neurosurgery, trauma, plastic surgery, all those areas which had fascinated me. And in those years between 1980 and 2000, I also spent a year at God's Lake First Nation in northern Manitoba, which was another life-changing experience, and took a job for 3 years as coordinator of the original Quality of Nursing Work-Life Research Unit at the University of Toronto. So I was exposed, while I was really focused very much in and around Sunnybrook and around clinical care, I did see some other worlds. And in fact, the job at the University of Toronto, the research coordinator job, really probably is what put into my mind that there could be a different future ahead, as I met researchers from many provinces across the country, was exposed to all kinds of work in research that had nothing to do with clinical. I was very focused on neurosurgery and spinal cord injury and so on. And that was a big eye-opening experience that years later people would say, I met you when you were at the university doing that role. So it also helped to put me onto a different kind of stage. I wasn't even aware of it at the time. Mm-hmm. It was only later that I realized how transformative that had been. But in those clinical roles, I was a staff nurse, then an instructor, nurse clinician. I was for a short time, a clinical nurse specialist. And then for the final 5 years, I was the patient care manager. Hardest 5 years of my life. Mm-hmm. Tough role, very tough mm-hmm. role. And I still so admire the people that agree to take those keys and take on that role. It was also a place I was very proud to be, still very proud to have been affiliated with Sunnybrook. So I tried a lot of things, and I think that's one of the lessons we will talk about is not staying too long in one place, or at least if you're in one organization like I was, that you try some different roles and see things from different vantage points, so that you have a series of different skills that you can market when you want to do some things at a different time. And that really prepared me, I think. It was completely happenstance. Amy, it wasn't a purposeful trajectory. I'm going to be this at the end of my career. If it had been anything, I would have thought I'll be a director of nursing. I think my view is very much organizational, maybe a VP. I looked up to the women. They were all women, my bosses, who were strong, centered, tough sometimes. You have to be, right, in those roles, people. And I would think, well, maybe that's what I'll be. But I don't think I thought really about a world beyond hospital walls and organizational administration. So it was a surprise to land in Ottawa in the year 2000 and to move from having been a patient care manager into the role as the senior nursing policy advisor in the Federal Office of Nursing Policy. It was like going on a shuttle to Mars. Yeah. Completely different world. And I've had now 20 years here. It's, my goodness, it's 2020. Yep. Of the most absolutely exciting, interesting, rewarding work I could ever have imagined. I never in the world, when I was making that decision in that emergency room in, 1978 or something, it's a long time, before any of you were born, that I would end up in that kind of world. I was sent to work with the OECD, for example, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. I was loaned to them when I was at the Office of Nursing Policy in the federal government and lived in Paris for a period of time. I mean, you have to pinch yourself every day. How in the hell did I get here? Yeah. How did I get here? So I still look out, the window of a plane. I was landing in Montenegro last month to do some work with a group of nurses in a country that wants to join the European Union, and having the same thought coming down across the mountains. What are you doing here? How did you get here? And what do you have to say to these people? And eventually you do have something probably to say, but there's days when I think, I don't have anything to teach you. I don't know, Yeah. So all of it's just been so amazing, just so amazing. And then to end up in this role, I'm the chief exec at the Canadian Nurses Association, as you just said, and I'm the 12th in a line of 112 years. The pictures are on the wall outside to prove it. Every time I walk past the wall, I genuflect briefly to my predecessors, all women, and then the weight of the whole thing is on your shoulders. And again, you think, how am I here? How did I get here? So, and this is the best job. And I mean, I've had so many great jobs, but there's no question this is a bit of a capstone job. And at my age, as I tell every audience, probably the last job. I'm not going to want to continue this pace, into my 70s, and it's going to be enough to do it through my 60s. And so I'm glad that it's the best. And then, you sort of go out, it's tough and there's hard days and so on, but to have this opportunity as the last job, just unbelievable. Great career, great privilege.
That's amazing. And I want to talk a little bit about the Canadian Nurses Association, just because we have listeners from all over the world. And I really think that the CNA and Canadian nurses are well respected globally when we attend these international conferences, and the CNA has had a big voice globally as well. So for those people that are interested in the CNA, can you tell them a bit about the academy that has just launched, and as well the importance of being part of a professional association and having a federal voice?
Sure. So the CNA is the national professional association in our country. So different from regulators who protect the public, where Mike goes to get his license every year, and you sign up and you pay, and they vet you to make sure that you're not going to hurt people or organizations and so on. Different from the union, which in our country advocates for the individual's rights and compensation and hours of work and those sorts of things. CNA is the voice of the profession. So when we think about how do we get to a point where every nurse, every registered nurse in the country has to have a baccalaureate degree. Where did that movement come from? How did we get nurse practitioners? Mm-hmm. How do we get to the place where nurses can prescribe, or that nurses are involved in medical assistance in dying, those sorts of things? Those are really the results of the work of professional associations like CNA and its partners across the country. There's also a huge number of professional associations in this country that are specialty focused. So critical care, hospice, children, there's 44 or 46 specialty groups. So there's a number of them, but CNA is the singular national voice that, in a sense, by its role since the early 1900s, is the place that is the kind of convener or the center, the hub with a whole lot of spokes, I suppose, of associations and organizations around it. And one of the things two of the things we do are, you've mentioned, one is around our work in advocacy. So CNA for more than a century has had a pretty profound impact, I think, on many aspects of federal and sometimes provincial health legislation through our constant work with, I won't say lobbying against, because that's not really what we do. We work with governments to say, okay, you're going to make cannabis legal. Here's what you have to think about. You're going to make it the right of women to have an abortion. You're going to make it the right of people to have medically assisted death. Here's the things you need to think about. How will it impact legislation? How will it impact people? How will it impact providers, and so on? And I think we're so lucky now that we've come to a place, Amy, where I genuinely believe that the federal government would not make any major move in legislation without asking, what does the CNA think? And that wasn't always the case. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a different sort of level of influence. I don't mean they come crawling up the driveway, begging for our help, but they would not say we're going to make a big legislative change and not ask what 400,000 nurses think. Mm-hmm. So it's on the radar now. Mm-hmm. And part of that is because of leadership, which is the other thing you mentioned. So we just late in 2019 launched the Canadian Academy of Nursing, which we intend to be a hub where we will identify, support, provide education, provide celebration and reward to the most accomplished nurses in the country. We have, through a really great arrangement over a number of years, worked with the Dorothy Wiley Health Leaders Institute so that they will now sit entirely within the Academy at CNA. The former Academy of Canadian Executive Nurses is coming in under CNA and they bring with them their Journal of Nursing Leadership, so that now all nurses who belong to CNA will get the Journal of Nursing Leadership as well as our own journal. And it will be a place where we'll have a fellowship program, much like the American Academy of Nursing or the Canadian Academy of Health Science, which is an honorific program to honor the country's most accomplished nurses. And they will be installed this year in the Nightingale 200th year. Our inaugural fellows will be inducted this year.
Amazing.
So we're excited.
Yeah, it's gonna 2020 has such great momentum for nurses around it. And I just want to go back to the one part you mentioned about being really a partner with the federal government about things that impact nurses and consulting on policy and that sort of thing. How do you get prepared for a role like that? I know a lot of nurses listening are like, I would have no idea where to start. So how would a nurse who's got some inclination towards that type of practice, what sort of things would they need to be doing now to start their career on that sort of trajectory?
Well, it's a good question. So first of all, it is a set of skills that you have to learn. And some of us learned that late. And I think because historically we have had a bit of a pattern in nursing of saying, this one's a great clinical nurse, so he or she should obviously become the manager or the teacher. And, that's just not true. Mm-hmm. And that's how we've operated. Yeah. And maybe the great clinical nurse got that job because he or she was popular And I don't mean this in a bad way. I mean it as a compliment. They were probably a good person. They're fun to be around and so on. But suddenly you throw them in these roles and expect them to survive. And I've been in that position. Mm-hmm. And we have had some of that history in public policy, which is why I often say, you can't demand a seat in a policy circle and then just sit there keeping the seat warm. You better be ready to figure out mm-hmm. what's the game. So some things have changed dramatically in nursing during the time. So I graduated 35 or 38 years ago, something like that. In that interval, you're much more likely now in a baccalaureate program to encounter at least some leadership, policy, and change-making education. Mm-hmm. And that's a new thing. You certainly will now absolutely more likely encounter a master's program in leadership that will include public policy as some aspect of the training. And so, for example, at the University of Toronto, where I teach, most of the students in all the master's programs now, I think, have to take the public policy course because they're all expected to advocate for patients and understand how does that work? What are the rules and who's in charge? And we often are frustrated in nursing by that very question. We don't know who's in charge. Mm-hmm. And so we're banging our heads against the wall at the wrong person because we just simply don't understand the governance structure around whatever the problem is. But you don't have to do a master's degree as your first step. There are so many opportunities to watch how things work. So volunteer to be on a board. People are always trying to get people to join boards. So you have to give a little bit of your time, for sure, or sometimes a lot of your time. Mm-hmm. I'm a board chair of a hospital, so I'm quite aware that the demands can be high. But there's people on there who run the local grocery store, and or they run a jiu-jitsu studio. They're not nurses and doctors, so you can it's possible to join those boards and learn. Watch how governance happens. Watch how decisions are made. What's the difference between policy and operational decisions? That happens everywhere. Regulators are looking for people to be on their boards. Professional associations, in hospitals all the time. There's task forces, unit committees. Just start to expose yourself to leadership roles. I think it makes such a big difference. And when we think in this country, so think of CNA, we're always looking for people for editorial board, to review papers, to help with conventions, like all that kind of stuff. Multiply that by 13 jurisdictions, 4 regulated categories, unions, regulators, right? There's lots and lots of organizations in which you can get involved. And I don't think it's smart to say the first thing I want to do is be the president of CNA, because you're not going to win. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not likely that you're going to win. And you're not going to be well equipped to lead a national association. So I say ease into it, and you can move along pretty quickly, but start to learn how decisions get made. Who makes them? Who influences them? Who's supposed to make them, and who actually does is an interesting lesson to learn. But I encourage, because people often ask me, how did you get to where you are? Now, part of it, I'll be honest, I have a graduate education. Mm-hmm. Like, it doesn't hurt. You know that. So, the master's degree after your name doesn't hurt. But I'll tell you, mine was in neurosurgery. Had nothing to do with, neurosurgical nursing, had nothing to do with policy. Yep. I probably would have been better served in the role I am now if I had a degree in decision-making and policy from Harvard. But I had a very, very good degree from the University of Toronto, Master of Science, that helped my brain work and think about complex things. So I think I think encouraging formal education is a good thing, but there's lots of other opportunities. I'll give you an example. I'm going into the College and Association of Registered Nurses of Alberta next week or 2 weeks from now to do a 2-day workshop in how to influence public policy. And it's packed.
I'm going to be there.
Oh, are you? Oh, fantastic. So we do those all over. We just did them at McGill. We did them at the Jewish General in Montreal. And nurses came with problems like, there's too much noise on our unit at night. There's too much deep fat frying in the hospital. We want to have less fryers. All the way to nurses who said we should have a minimum entry to practice as a baccalaureate. This is in Quebec where they don't have that yet. So the range of problems that the different people in the audience were tackling were all over the place. But a lot of the principles are the same. What's the plan? Who's in charge? How do you figure out how to influence them? And sometimes whether you're influencing federal cannabis legislation or the fat fryer in the hospital, you still need to kind of follow some of the same program. So those workshop opportunities are everywhere, and they're cheap. I mean, relatively cheap compared to a $25,000 a year master's program, and you can pick up a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I encourage anybody that's thinking about leadership or has an urge to get more involved to just check it out. I mean, nobody is ever fully prepared for those roles. So as long as you're going in with a beginner mindset and you're willing to learn and grow and evolve on the job, if you have an interest, just put your hand up and try. I think fear holds a lot of people back from, even just saying like, yeah, I might be interested in that. So if you're thinking about it, just make the jump, because there's only one way to find out if you'll enjoy it or not, or learn from it or not, and that's to actually do it. So I
agree. People. And so those nurses, most of whom were staff level or like a first level clinical instructor, for example, the crowd we had at McGill so they had a day of learning, and they had to go away and work on a project and come back with a briefing note and a slide presentation. And then we did a second day. And the whole first morning coming back was all their briefing notes and slide presentations. I was completely blown away. Unbelievable. So these people are brilliant at the point of care, like the coal face, as we say. They just need a few tips to figure, like, this is how you got to think about it. And they came back like I would have been convinced by every single one of their presentations. Some of them were better than what I would have done. Yeah. So it doesn't take a lot to free people up to think differently.
No, and that's one of my frustrations, with healthcare in general, is that we're making these policies and the decisions are coming down, and very rarely are the point of care nurses consulted. And lots of times they have the answer. They know what would work. And we've created these systems that don't allow us to connect directly with them. Or by the time you're into policy, you've been removed a bit from, like, I know even with my job, like, I'm not direct with patients anymore. And you lose that perspective once you've been out of it for a little bit. So I'm constantly asking the nurses that are actually doing the work with the patient, would this work? Does this make sense? What am I missing? What didn't I, think of? And so we really need to foster those conversations within higher levels of government too, and the regulatory bodies and associations, everybody, to really be connecting with those frontline nurses, because, Joanne Peterson's going to be mad I said frontline. Point of care nurses.
Yes, you're going to get trouble down.
Hey nurses, I just wanted to take a quick break from the podcast and tell you about something really important that's happening. So 2020 has been designated as Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. And it's really great to be celebrating nurses and to be sharing trending hashtags. But what we really need to do is get into action, because it's up to us. And nothing is going to change if we don't make the change. So there's a movement happening, and it needs you. We're stronger together. So come join us as we disrupt the status quo and evolve our profession. It's time. We are stronger together, so let's get started. If you want to know how you can join this movement of change, visit nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse to opt in for a free 3-part video series about how we can use 2020, the Year of the Nurse and Midwife, as the year we finally use our collective voice and lead our profession forward. So jump over to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse for all the details. Now back to the episode. So one of the things too, Mike, that I wanted to address that was pretty monumental, I believe it was in 2018 in June, you guys announced that the CNA was now open to all the professions of nursing.
Yes.
And so I just want you to talk a bit about that and how we are stronger together and what that looks like moving forward.
Sure. And we don't totally know yet. It's an unfolding story, but CNA was the home of nurses and I'm saying nurse on purpose there, because it was formed before there was regulation. And so it became the place where regulation, along with our partners, of course, in the provinces, sort of got talked about and batted around, and what should entry to practice look like, and how do you test people and so on for the first 20 years really of the association. And then there was only one category. So some were registered nurses, some were not, some were grandfathered in. So if you had graduated in 1914, let's say, like my grandmother from the Montreal General, you never had to register. You were just allowed to kind of work because you'd been there already for a long time by the time there was registration in Quebec. So I say that because we just became the de facto home of RNs. And when practical nurses, which used to be called registered nurse assistants, are originally just nursing assistants and later registered or licensed in the 1940s, they were considered very much the assistant role, not a profession. And in fact, even now in some unions and stuff, they're sort of lumped as a different category, treated a different way than the so-called white-collar registered nurse profession. So CNA, with no ill intent, I believe, just maintained that through the years. And it was just always the home of RNs. And what I had the opportunity in the Office of Nursing Policy, which is probably the first place I started thinking about this, between 2000 and 2004. And for people listening, that's the federal government office of the federal chief nurse, which existed at that time, Judith Shamian, and came to see there the number of organizations across the country in nursing. And I mentioned it earlier, 13 jurisdictions, 4 categories, like start adding it up, right? It doesn't end, unions and regulators and professional associations and specialty groups, and all speaking what almost becomes noise because you don't know who to listen to. Mm-hmm. And we certainly heard directly from ministers and deputies and stuff. Well, who's speaking here? Is it the union? Is it the professional association? Is it CAUSN, the schools of nursing? What's your message? And we watched early on a couple of meetings that were pretty not effective. And I'll say that as the kindest way to say it, as just an observer thinking, oh, we don't look good here. So one of the, I suppose, bugaboos in my own soul through the 20 years I've been in this role is, so there's 427,000 of us now, roughly, or 426.5, something like that, in all the categories. Might we not be better served having at least some place where we have something in common? There will still be provincial associations and specialty groups and so on, but what if there was a house, I say that term loosely, but a place where they all came together on some issues? And I say to every group, we're never going. People talk about nursing should speak with one voice. Nursing's never going to speak one voice. 427,000 people are going to have a million voices, but they're going to have 427,000 voices, I suppose. But what if there was 3 or 4 messages that they were all dancing around some aspect of it in a similar way? So the LPNs think this way about this issue, and the psych nurses think this way, and so on. And it just struck me that divide and conquer isn't going to work in this century. And there's an expectation of collaboration. We talk about interprofessional collaboration. We talk endlessly about interprofessional and how we have to work well on teams. And that maybe getting our own house in order, as I would put it, mm-hmm. is an important first step to, stepping out in front of the public. So we talked about this across the country in 2017, 2018. I started in May of 2017, and we spent a year talking to as many groups as we could across the country about why we thought for the future of professional nursing in this country and a place for it, meaning CNA, whether it's called something different in the future or whatever, but it's a place, it would be an advantage. And this had been talked about before, and it was not voted in. But in our vote in June, the vote was 135 for and 10 against. So it was a slam dunk
Mm-hmm.
vote as far as I'm concerned. All registered nurses, remember.
Mm-hmm.
So they made a decision that the House of Nursing should be for nursing, not just for registered nurses. And now, of course, now the scramble has been on for us who are doing the operational work to put all the structures in place and make it a friendly, embracing, welcoming place. And I made so many mistakes. I'll share with you that the one that just killed me. I spent a year sending out letters with letterhead that says on it, "The voice of registered nurses." Didn't even see it. Like
Oh no.
stuff you don't see because you see it every day.
Yeah.
And I got a note from a slightly angry LPN in New Brunswick last week. If you're listening, you'll know who you are. We had a great talk, saying your web page, your opening page of your website, still is all about RNs. And I thought, well, what is she talking about? So I go on there, honest to God. The first thing I see in the right-hand corner, how to become a registered nurse. Right? So,
Interesting.
of course,
Yeah.
you think you've dismantled all the old structures and you keep finding new ones. So it's been a very major task to turn a ship of 112 years that's always been about one group.
Yeah.
And put all the language and policies in place so that people feel welcome. But people have joined, and our first class of licensed practical nurses who wrote the first certification exam we've ever had that was for non-RNs, there was 50 of them, and they all passed in November. So we're starting to, we'll start to build those structures that show that we're committed to all the categories.
That's amazing. And I really believe there's room for all of us within the healthcare system. We just need to find that way of how we work best together. I mean, globally, we're facing a shortage of something like 9 million nurses in the next 10 years. There is room for everybody. We just need to come together and really figure out what that looks like so that we're moving together in the same direction and supporting each other instead of this kind of turf wars and battles that we've been having within our profession.
There's plenty. Like I often say, Amy, if every doctor, well, there's all kinds of other categories, but let's just say every doctor and every nurse in this country worked 24 hours a day for the next century, we still wouldn't get half the care done. Mm-hmm. So there's not a problem with, there's no demand issue. There's a supply problem. So we just need to figure out how will we, as you say, what's the right number? What's the right mix? When is this category safer versus that one? Or when maybe any four could do this care. It doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. We just have got to figure that out a little bit. What are the competencies we need to do these different things? And the same with the docs. There's lots of things they're doing they don't need to do.
Yes.
So there's all kinds of shifting of skills that's going to have to happen because the demand is just always going to overwhelm us.
Well, and I think one of the biggest things too is, what does healthcare in the future look like? I think part of our solutions have been focused on fitting into the system as it currently is or currently was. And it's time for an evolution and revolution of the healthcare system in general. And what do nurses look like within that model moving forward? So instead of trying to fit into the way things have been, what does it look like moving forward? What could it be like? And moving forward to that goal instead of trying to fit in an old system.
You're absolutely right. And the challenge, or a challenge in that, of course, is we still are operating the old system. So you've sort of got to have a bit of a bridge time, to continue this way, but start the new. And, there's no question, if evidence was all it took, we'd have a completely different kind of system. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't look anything like it does. So I always say to nurses, it's to figure out what are all those other forces. What's the holding back on this issue? And that keeps us from, if we know that this piece of care would be better done in a home, why can't we get that done? Mm-hmm. Like, what is it? Is it funding, fee structures? Like, there's all kinds of those things that have nothing to do with the evidence, that are political pains in the butt, mm-hmm. that are really, really tough to undo. But we've got to figure it out fast, because I'm the back end of the baby boom, right? So the baby boom went to about 1962, so I'm 61 years old. Many of my baby boom counterparts are into their mid to late 70s. Mm-hmm. So, sadly what that means is we're going to start talking about frailty and dementia soon with a lot of them. What are we going to do? Mm-hmm. I mean, Mr. Ford in Ontario was elected partly on a promise of 15,000 more long-term care beds, which are needed. And the office of the Financial Accountability Office said you'll need those plus 55,000 more.
Wow.
Well, we're not going to have 55,000 more long-term care beds in Ontario. So what in the name of God are we going to do to take care of Michael Villeneuve when he gets to be at that point, right? Like, what are we actually going to do?
Yeah.
And they can't all be at home. They can't be alone. I know because I cared for a father with dementia. You can't even go out to the store.
No.
So it's not okay to say just do more home care. You need 24-hour a day home care. How are we going to manage that? Unless we group them somehow. So I don't know what the model is. I don't mean to go on about that, Amy, but we got a big pressing problem, and it's right now. It's not a theory. It's already there. They're already in their mid-70s.
Yep. And again, these are the type of challenges and problems that if we were really looking to evolve the profession forward and move healthcare in a better direction, we'd be having these discussions with point of care staff and actually asking, because I bet you somewhere out there somebody has a wonderful idea and they just don't know how to get it out there. So if you're listening and you have a great idea, just email us, nurseleaders.ca/connect, and we'll get it up the chain.
Email Amy, but also come to the convention where in June. I'm not trying to sell convention seats, but we're going to try one of our sessions have a hackathon around great ideas in healthcare. How would you scale up innovation? And see what we can come up with. And we have a great speaker, Richard Booth, who some of you will know is a leader in artificial intelligence and robotics and technology in healthcare. And we thought following that we might do some of that. Like how can you really get it doesn't have to be a tech idea, but some of them will involve technology. Mm-hmm. And there's people out there already like Amazon ready to drone your meds to you and so on. So that there's a different world, and we do need those ideas from point of care nurse. Point of care. Joanne, I know you're listening. I won't say front line. No front line, Joanne Peterson. God,
yes, we love her.
And Braden, who I taught at U of T, Braden Davey, and Dave's in BC, was always the same. Wanted to smack me around when I said front line. So a nod to Braden and a nod to Joanne.
Yeah, we're learning slowly. I catch myself all the time. It's just habit.
Yeah, it's just habit. Yeah, it's just habit.
So, Mike, we know that 2020 has been designated Year of the Nurse and Midwife. What changes would you like to see the nursing profession make this year? So not, in 10 years or 15. What would you like to see happen this year?
Well, okay, first that's a tough question.
Yeah, sorry, it was rather loaded.
No, it's okay. It's a short amount of time, right? And one of our collective fears is that we won't take advantage of the momentum of this year. Right. So we need to, it'll go very, very quickly. Nurses are busy. Their eyes are focused on patients and so on. So here's a couple of thoughts. We often hear about how we are the most respected and trusted profession. And that gets repeated year after year after year. I think the last one was 2018, or maybe it was 2019, the last poll in Canada. And I know there was another one last week, but it was American. So if you just speak of the Canadian ones, there we are. There's a second Canadian study that was done by, I think that Linda Silas and the CFNU team sponsored that one. And it found that more Canadians than trust information coming from nursing associations than from any other source. 87% of Canadians, far and away from everyone else. So they trust our associations, they trust us. I would like every nurse this year to be able to say that's our superpower. Mm-hmm. I wish we would stop saying we don't have influence in health policy, because we do have influence in health policy. We may not communicate it as clearly as we CNA and our counterparts as we need to, but that's a big piece of power. And I say to every group I talk to every time, Amy, is there any profession in society that wouldn't want to the public to say we trust you more than anybody? The public will. Here's the example I always use. Now I'm sitting here beside my puppy in my office. She's 1.5 years and she's asleep here beside me. I would not leave her for an hour without anyone, without looking at a website to see if they got references and are they good to dogs and blah, 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 right? Mm-hmm. We do all that. Mm-hmm. People walk into an emergency room and hand you their child. Hand it over. Yeah. And say, fix it.
Yeah.
and they go home and sleep. Now, they might not sleep well and they might be upset and everything, but they'll give you their spouse, their parent, their child, their friend, their neighbor. They don't say, show me that you've been vetted. There is a trust and that's the fear, of course, of things like the case we had in Ontario when nurses misbehave criminally.
Yeah.
That could be a problem. I don't think it is a widespread problem. And no, I don't think. I mean, it is not a widespread problem, but the fear is there. No, it is not. It's not. We know that. But when you're in the top position, there's only one place to go. So you have to guard that and not chip away at that at all. And I think what I would love this year, every nurse's face up high, proud. Every other profession would kill to have the power we have. And stop saying we don't have power. You have been accorded a lot of power by the public when they say we trust you completely. Completely. So we need to, I know it's hard to step out of things. And I always quote the woman, I'm going to forget, Maggie Kuhn, who founded the American Association of Retired People and who said, speak up even if your voice shakes. Speak up, put your face up and speak up. We can't afford to stand back anymore. So this year, I hope, I don't tangibly that will come out of the year. I think personally, I hope we come out with a resolution at the World Health Organization level that will put meat around actually strengthening nursing in countries. And not just everyone signing accords and saying, oh, yes, we think it's important to have a strong nursing workforce and then do nothing about it. So, I mean, I think at a global level, there's a problem. If we can't, if we're going to be short 6 or 9 million, whatever the prediction is, action has to happen. So I want that at the formal level. But at the individual level, I would like to hear nurses say that with pride because it's true.
Yeah.
It's a superpower.
Yeah. So this is another loaded question, and it may piggyback on what you've already said, but what do you think is one of the biggest challenges facing nurses today, and what might we go about solving that challenge?
We hinted on it earlier, which is if evidence was enough, we'd have a different healthcare system. A huge challenge for us is to find a way to help all of us step back, look at the reality of care that is being demanded by the public of Canada in this case, and think about what kinds of sets of competencies are needed to deliver care to that group. Rather than saying, we have this many nurses, this is what we can do, and this many doctors. This is the population health need. Who here could meet that? That's going to be hard for nurses. And so I'll step back. My predecessor in the 60s to 80s, the great Dr. Helen Musalem, was in the first class of registered nurses that were allowed to take blood pressures. And that sounds ridiculous today. But that was going to be the end of it, right? Oh my God, the nurses are going to take blood pressures. That's the end of healthcare. And it was the same the first time we gave intramuscular injections and so on. So now we're on the cusp of that with prescribing, for example. And you may have heard me say this before, Amy, but we are at a place, we have all arrived at a place together where a registered nurse with a master's degree, I'm not talking about a nurse practitioner, but the great mass of registered nurses, registered psych nurses, cannot order for you the over-the-counter medications that your child can buy at Shoppers Drug Mart.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We've come to that together. So how do you uncouple from tradition and say, nobody owns competencies? I would say in this country, we don't have a shortage of doctors. We have a shortage of people providing primary care. And lots of people can provide primary care. In some cases, it might be a mental health worker, a counselor. It might be, in many places, I imagine, it would be a registered nurse who can say, I mean, I sit in my own emergency room where happen to be the board chair. I've been sick a couple of times. Look around the room, and I can pick off 3/4 of them fracture, UTI, sore ear. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
it's not what we have co-created a condition where the only person that can diagnose has a title MD. And how we uncouple from that, I don't know the road forward from that. But I know that in the countries like the UK, where they made a decision, how long ago, almost 20 years ago now, or 15 years ago, to have standalone clinics run by nurses, that the United Kingdom didn't fall into the sea.
Mm-hmm.
And the NHS is the highest rated healthcare system in the world in the Commonwealth Fund studies. And when I'm there, I get care fast and easy. I got pneumonia there. Everyone's heard this story. Went to the freestanding nurse clinic. Everybody triaged within 4 minutes, out the door within 2 hours, 200 patients a day.
Wow.
So why aren't we doing that?
Mm-hmm.
That is what the public needs nurses to do. They will still need nurses to put dressings on in recovery rooms, and I understand all that. But there is a great expanded need out there where registered nurses, registered site nurses, practical nurses in some cases could populate some of those kinds of clinics. And just imagine if we only took our big cities and did that model where we just had nurses picking people off at the door. Say, no, you come this way and we'll triage you, and you're never going to see a doctor at all because you don't need to.
Mm-hmm.
That's the reality. You don't. It's not unsafe. It's as safe, as effective or more effective, as satisfying or more satisfying, same cost or less cost. Clear in the systematic reviews. Like it's so the challenge, that's the big one. How will we change what nursing practice is? And Tim Porter O'Grady says it so much more eloquently than I when he talks about hospital nursing practice, that most of us are educated and regulated and deployed for our residency model, where someone comes in, we do a long assessment, and now the average assessment, I think Lynn Nagel, the informatics guru, I think she said takes 50 minutes, 50 minutes, for people who might have a 24-hour stay. So think about that. So we're still thinking that they're going to be there for 5 days. Mm-hmm. And that we're managing beds and residency. And Tim says we are managing turnover and mobility. How do you recruit the kind of person, then educate them and regulate them so that they're dealing with a patient whose trajectory is 36 hours? And not like when I graduated, this is going to show my age again, people came into hospital at least a day to rest before surgery. Then they had their back surgery or their brain surgery, whatever they had. And then they had 3 or 4 days in the hospital. Well, you know now, they're in the same morning. And if they're gagging and awake in the afternoon, they're in a cab, right? And home for home care. So the kind of nurse and the kind of nursing practice to meet that need has to shift. And I do think some of the dissatisfaction and angst among nurses, as I watch them, is that disconnect. And they can tell you the pace and the intensity and the unpredictability. All those things have grown. I totally get it. But if your brain is saying, "I want to do care this way. I was trained to do this. We should be doing this," but that's gone. Mm-hmm. So how do we, as a profession, do two things? How do we shift to meet that reality? And then how do we shift to meet the competency reality being demanded by the public, which is for elder care, seniors care, primary care, mental health, addictions, and dementia?
Whew.
Sorry,
I don't have any easy answers on those.
No, but that's why we would have solved it if it was easy, right? Yeah. And that's why CNA is so. These are like big, almost intractable problems, and sides get dug in. We've been dug in sometimes RNs versus LPNs, right? Yeah. Nurse practitioners, RNs, doctors, nurse practitioners. There's all kinds of pain points there. The problem is the rubbing against each other isn't making it easier for people to get care.
Correct.
There's plenty for us all to do. So how do you sort of lubricate those friction points and say, okay, here's how we're going. Lots of people can do these 4 tasks. Lots can do those 4. So in this setting, in a clinic in Moncton, these are the kinds of people that are going to do those things. An LPN and a physician maybe are fine for those sets of skills. I don't know what it is. I'm just making stuff up now. Yeah. But we're not there yet.
So I'm going to ask a question that might get me in trouble. So with the nurse practitioner role in Canada, So when I early in my career, I was labor and delivery nurse, and I traveled in the U.S. and I got exposure to certified nurse midwives, which worked in a hospital-based setting. They worked as part of a practice, um, and so that's what I actually did my master's in, was certified nurse midwifery and women's health. And down there, the nurse practitioner, and I was a women's health NP. But as soon as I came back up to Canada, that didn't translate because we're generalized, right, with the nurse practitioner thing. So I had a master's, but I chose not to do the nurse practitioner route. But down there, they have, nurse anesthetists, and they have family NPs, and they have, pediatric NPs, a certified nurse midwife. They have geriatric midwives. They have so many specialty roles for these nurse practitioners, and you have to have a clinical base in that before you can apply into some of these programs. But they come out, after a 2-year master's, super specialized in those areas. And some of those things would help solve our healthcare challenges up here, like having certified nurse midwives that could do deliveries in some of those rural hospitals. They can do first assist with C-sections, all those competencies that we don't have up here. Why did we choose to stay so generalized with NPs in Canada? Do you know?
Well, I don't know the whole history of that, Amy, but certainly there's been a back and forth around whether they should have specialties and subspecialties versus be a generalist. Same thing with the BSCN, right? Should the undergrad be more like the UK, where there's mental health? I don't remember, peds, public health, and adults, maybe something like that, or there's 4 or 5 categories. But Canada, for what I think some would say is good reasons, has maintained this road of generalist at all levels with added specialty training later. I know there has been, certainly there are midwives across the country, as you well know,
Yep.
but the advanced practice roles of nurse anesthetist didn't catch on, and that may be partly pressure from physician anesthetists. I don't know how real that is. And there seemed here to be, you give me something good to investigate, I suppose, going forward. But there seems to have been a resistance to the nurse midwife, and that the midwife is the standalone entity. So I don't know the whole history, Amy. It's a very good question. And I don't know. I think part of our challenge is smaller population. And sometimes you get you get into a problem when you have not enough people to fill sort of the cells for all those subspecialties. But certainly we have been asked repeatedly, more than the nurse midwife, about why we don't have nurse anesthetists here. And my own care when I had in the U.S., a very interesting experience when I laid on the operating room table. On one side of me was a physician's assistant who had a master's degree in nursing. The other side was a nurse practitioner who specialized in the area of surgery I was having, and at my head, a nurse anesthetist, and no surgeon in sight. And the surgeon would come in the middle, do the tiny little, highly technical piece that was his, and leave. So it certainly isn't. It's not like it's not on my radar that the model's out there, Amy, but I just haven't heard much support for moving forward in either of those here. Do you know?
Well, I don't know specifically, but I think, again, it's a thing of nurses don't know that's an option, right? Until I went down in the States and worked in them, I had no idea. I mean, I'd wanted to deliver babies since I was 4 years old. Like, that was my thing. And when I went down there and I was like, what? I can actually do this without having to go be a doctor? This is amazing. And, when I got back up into Canada, the model, it just wasn't set up to be sustainable for me. And so I went back to nursing and because I did register as a midwife for a while in Alberta. But my passion is within rural. And I mean, I came from a town of 600 people. At the time I grew up in the community, there was a thriving hospital. They had family doctors. Now we can't retain a physician there. We have this huge hospital that's been now just long-term care beds. And we have smart nurses working in those communities who, would take advanced care training to do some of these other things and open up services in the rural areas, but we're not allowing them to do that. And I think it's such a disservice to the rural population. We had a medical emergency a couple weeks ago, and it's 45 minutes to the nearest emergency department.
Wow.
Well, when you can't breathe, that's a really long time.
Yeah.
And
Well, Amy, it's an interesting conundrum, and maybe one of the things we're doing in the at the time of our meeting in June around the because it's the year of the nurse and midwife, and the 200th anniversary, is having a focused conversation with nurse leaders, not thousands of people, but a smaller group of leaders at the national level, to talk about what are the kinds of policy solutions we might want to really put on the table going forward. So that's the kind of thing you may want to bring to that discussion. I know that, like, the University of Toronto, for example, where I have my longest affiliation, has started is starting a Doctor of Nursing program in the fall. Yeah, it's 2020, in September of 2020, recognizing the need for nurses trained in public policy and leadership, but who don't necessarily want to go through the full. They don't want to be academics, and so they don't need the full range of the PhD behind their name. So I think smart organizations do respond to these sorts of needs. We've never had registered psych nurses, for example, anywhere east of Manitoba. And now we have 2 or 3 provinces saying, well, maybe we should have those.
Yeah.
So, I think there are open minds in governments and decision-making and people who make decisions. And maybe, that kind of conversation that you raised goes back on the table.
Well, you just let me know. I'm willing to take it up.
Yeah. And I mean, I never pretend on a personal level to be an expert in all these things. I don't know every piece of that history. I just know there's been a bit of a resistance to expansion of that advanced practice beyond, what are they called, clinical nurse specialists and nurse practitioners.
Well, maybe 2020 is the year we'll have
new
discussions. You never know. So, Mike, I'm just mindful of time. This conversation has just flown by. So I want to just start looking at closing. But as a leader in the nursing profession, what change do you hope to have to impact, and what would you like your legacy to be at the end of your nursing career?
I suppose at the most general level, I hope that people would say, people will say all kinds of things about you when you're gone, but I hope at least one would be that I made an honest effort to help shape some aspects of the profession so that we sort of free nurses from the hamstrings they sometimes have, either of their way they're educated, regulated, deployed, all those things. I'm not blaming any person, but just the way that we use the nursing workforce, so that they're freed up to deliver the kind of care that I fully, completely believe they're absolutely qualified and able to deliver, and not to feel, sort of boxed in to a narrow range of skills that, kind of shuts off part of them. And we spent 40 years to educate to have the best educated generation of nurses in history and almost in the world. This all baccalaureate degree workforce, and many of whom have masters and PhDs on top of that. And so why did we do that if we want them to do the same thing?
Yes.
Like, why? What was that for? And when I had my own big surgical events, I've had a few in the last decade, and I watched, of course, the nursing pretty carefully. I was really struck by how the technology has changed. There's a lot of more flashy pumps and pieces of equipment around, and much of my care was very good, but it wasn't really fundamentally any different than what I learned and did in 1980. And I thought, boy, the whole world has changed, but it's almost like there's this slow motion thing around nursing, not the individual people, that the tsunami has gone around them. Paramedics are doing all kinds of different things, physicians' assistants, even the doctors. The doctors are so patient-focused and so good. Like, they must have had a generation of really good training around patient focus and eye contact, because they were fantastic. Now, some of it is they knew who I was. So they, you might have a little privilege there, but I don't know. I had a sense that they were pretty much acting the way they act all the time. And the nurses were lovely, by the way. I don't mean that they weren't, but the practice hadn't really changed. So I think I would like to be part of that shaking off of the notion that somebody owns competencies, only one person can do that thing. No, heads up, face forward, strong, and really doing what we're able to do for the public.
Yeah, I love it. So, Mike, do you have 3 tangible takeaways or pieces of advice that you could leave our listeners with today?
This is always the hard stuff, eh?
Yes.
So I thought about a couple of things. First, my advice to every nurse and every student I talk to is, especially in the early part of your career, whether you're a young career or an older person starting in a career, is to say yes to everything. I said yes to everything from the time I went into the hospital for the first 10 years. I was exhausted. And I had if people said, do you want to help teach a course? Yep. You want to help write an article? Yep. And I didn't always have the skill set to do it, Amy, honest to God.
Yeah.
But people reached out, mentored me, helped. And suddenly, in 10 years, you got a few publications and you've presented at a few conferences, and you're not looking for your first job as, let's say, a manager with a CV that's basically blank and says you took 3 professional development courses. And I've seen a lot of those. So getting active early, I think, really makes a difference. And if people reach out to you, they already think you can do it. So take the chance. So that's the first thing. Second thing I say to every group, any person who asks, know about something. Whatever it is and however small it is. Let's say you are on a unit and you are the best spinal cord test nurse in the whole history of the world. Know at least one area where you can speak with confidence. And the challenge of a CEO role, of course, is that people stick a microphone in your face and want you to be confident in 50,000 topics, and you can't be. So part of that is acting, right?
Yeah.
But part of what helps you get to the CEO job is, I could talk, for example, about the seniors situation in this country probably for 20 minutes without any notes. Just because I spent some time reading, I know some statistics, how many have chronic diseases, what does it cost, so that you start to have a bit of an authority in an area, so that people say, wow, he knows a lot about that, like maybe he should come. And then eventually you're overwhelmed by he should come to everything. So I think having the confidence of knowledge in even the smallest area really helps. And the final thing I would say is Michelle Acorn and I agree on this. Michelle's the chief nurse of Ontario. Work hard, play hard, but be kind. Be kind. Yeah. It's a small world. And I regret any time when I think back when I thought, I was harsh with that person. I'm 61. I can still remember thinking, I was in a bad mood that day when I said something cranky to that fellow nurse. It leaves you feeling bad, leaves them feeling bad. And so I try now in every interaction as I can, no matter how hard we're working and how crazy the day is, be kind.
Yeah, I think that's so huge, and that's one of those pieces of everyday leadership that is so overlooked, but kindness really is leadership. And just looking for ways to impart a little more kindness in our world definitely right now is so very needed. So thank you for that.
I think so. Thank you.
So Mike, I just want to again thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. This has been amazing, and I really do appreciate your time. To just wrap up, could you tell us a story from your nursing career that's had an impact on you? Something to leave with the listeners today?
Sure, and thank you, by the way, Amy, for doing this series and this work. It's so important, and we're so glad that we will work with you to find a way to link all this to the Academy and to the leadership activity going across the country, because I really believe strongly that it has to be a living sort of thing, not a thing for old dead people, who have lots of credentials after their name. I include myself, that it be a living, breathing thing that has a life across the country. But it needs a house,
Yeah.
So we are the national house, so there will always be that piece. In terms of, there's been so many moments in my career that I remember, and one was an error that I made, and I won't go on about it because there's a video about it on the Canadian Patient Safety Institute website. You can look up. They have a series on health professionals and the impact of making an error on them, and that sits with me. It was a med error, wrong patient, overdose of a drug that was not good for him. Did not die, but I thought I was going to in the course of that, and that's impacted my whole career in how I made a rushed decision there, and I've never again been able to make decisions quickly. And it took me about 30 years to finally figure out. I think the root of it was around that, which is slow down. When you're in a CEO job, you can't. People want 1,000 answers a day.
Yeah.
You can't say, I'm going to go think about that and, go on a retreat for a week and figure out my feelings.
Yeah,
you have to give an answer. So that was a profound moment in my career. And of course, in my own humility, the young golden boy with the degree could make a mistake, and a very, very damaging one. But the other one was I had a patient who was comatose, a young guy. Typical trauma units typically are populated with a lot of younger people who don't always make the best decisions. And he was comatose, and I had just done usual care for me. He was in one of the private rooms, and I had just shaved him and cleaned him and whatever I did, changed the bed and all that. And I remember his father coming in and crying and saying, well, he's my son. And the sort of impact of the humanity was just unbelievable. And it makes me emotional now that in all that what's the word, technology and all the pace of that, the humanity of it is what mattered.
Yeah. And it's a good reminder, as nurses, we are so privileged to be part of those people's stories and the impact we can have on them, and to show that kindness and humility in those moments makes such an impact.
Small things. I mean, I didn't do anything kind. I just did, the morning bath, right? But without really thinking. I mean, in a strategic way. I wasn't thinking, I'm going to make this family feel better. I just shaved him and did whatever. And but the impact on that years later, just thinking, oh wow, that small thing for me was the big thing for them. And they didn't care about all the ICP monitoring and all that stuff that I was fussing about. It's that it looked like their child again. So the small gesture always stays with me.
Thank you for sharing that story. That's so impactful. And it beautifully ties up, like we have such an honor to be nurses and to make those moments count for people, and to remember that we're part of this huge moment for people's lives, and we can truly impact them and make it better. And that's really the honor of being a nurse. So thank you for sharing.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for including me in the series and a chance to talk about all this today.
No, this was wonderful. All right. So as we mentioned, 2020 is Year of the Nurse and the Midwife. We're running a free 3-part video series challenge to get nurses, no matter your scope, your role, your position, your title, into activity to really make this the Year of the Nurse. So you can go to nurseleaders.ca/2020nurse. Again, it's a free challenge. Just join there to sign up, and we are going to get into activity and really claim this as our year. So thank you everybody for listening, and thank you, Mike, for being here today.
Oh, thank you very much. And thanks everyone for listening.
Bye. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you loved the advice shared on this episode, we would be so grateful if you would let us know. Please head over to Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, and subscribe to our show, and then rate us and leave your review. We would be so grateful if you would take the time to subscribe, rate, and review. While you're on our website, nurseleaders.ca/connect, all of our social media handles are there, and we would love to get to know you on social media as well. Thank you again for listening today, and remember, nurses, we have the power to change the world. Let's start today.